The train whistle pierced the dry desert air as the locomotive slowed its approach to Timber Creek, a dusty outpost in Arizona territory. The year was 1885, and the West was still wild enough to make a man's word his bond and his gun his judge. Eleanor Thornton clutched her small valise tightly, peering through the soot-stained window at the town that would become her home. At 32, she had exchanged dozens of letters with Thomas Keegan, a cattle rancher whose advertisement for a bride had appeared in a Boston newspaper. After a year of correspondence filled with promises and growing affection, she had finally made the journey west. Eleanor smoothed the wrinkles from her traveling dress and tucked a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear. The life she knew, teaching children in a small Massachusetts school, was behind her now. I hope you'll enjoy this story. If you like it, please subscribe to the channel. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? As the train hissed to a stop, Eleanor gathered her courage along with her belongings. Thomas had described himself as a man of medium build, with a sandy mustache and kind eyes. She'd sent him a daguerreotype of herself 6 months prior, so he would recognize her immediately. The platform was crowded with a mix of cowboys, merchants, and families, all moving with the purposeful energy of frontier life. Eleanor descended carefully onto the wooden platform, the midday sun beating down mercilessly on her eastern complexion. She scanned the faces of those waiting, looking for the man whose words had convinced her to leave everything familiar behind. "Miss Thornton?" A deep voice came from behind her, causing her to turn abruptly. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dust-covered black hat and a tin star pinned to his vest. His face was weathered by sun and experience, with a strong jaw partially hidden beneath a neatly trimmed dark beard. He was not Thomas Keegan. "I'm Sheriff Matthew Holloway. I've come to meet you." Eleanor's heart sank as confusion washed over her features. "There must be some mistake. I'm expecting Mr. Thomas Keegan. We're to be married tomorrow at the church." The sheriff's expression hardened slightly, his blue eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. "I'm afraid there's been a complication, Miss Thornton. I've come to escort you to your lodgings at Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house. If you'll allow me to take your luggage." His words were polite, but there was an undercurrent of tension that Eleanor couldn't miss. "A complication? What do you mean? Where's Thomas?" Eleanor felt panic rising in her throat as she clutched her valise even tighter. The people around them continued their business, but a few curious glances were cast in their direction. Sheriff Holloway reached for her larger trunk that the porter had unloaded. "It's not a matter for the middle of the train platform, ma'am. Please, let me escort you to your lodgings, and I'll explain everything." His voice had softened slightly, but the authority in it remained. Eleanor hesitated before finally nodding. She had no choice but to trust this stranger with the badge. As they walked down the main street of Timber Creek, Eleanor noticed the typical establishments of a western town: the general store, a saloon with piano music spilling from its swinging doors, the blacksmith shop ringing with the sound of metal on metal. Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house stood 2 stories tall, painted white with blue trim, a stark contrast to the dusty brown that dominated the town. The older woman who greeted them had kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Eleanor of her aunt back east. "Welcome to Timber Creek, Miss Thornton. I've prepared my best room for you." She shot a questioning look at the sheriff, who responded with an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Once Eleanor's belongings were settled in her room, Sheriff Holloway asked Mrs. Whitaker for some privacy. The 3 of them sat in the parlor, and Eleanor could no longer contain her anxiety. Please, Sheriff, tell me what has happened to Thomas. Is he ill? Has there been an accident?" The sheriff removed his hat, revealing dark hair with flecks of gray at the temples. "Thomas Keegan is alive and well, Miss Thornton. His ranch is prospering, and he's as respected a cattleman as you'll find in these parts." He paused, his fingers working the brim of his hat. "But there's something you should know about the man you came to marry." Eleanor waited, her breath caught in her throat. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, marking the seconds of uncomfortable silence. 3 years ago, the sheriff continued, Thomas Keegan was engaged to marry my sister Catherine. They had plans, dreams for a life together. She had traveled from our family home in Missouri to be with him, much as you've done now. A coldness settled in Eleanor's stomach. What happened to her? 2 weeks before their wedding, there was an outbreak of fever. Catherine was among those who didn't survive. His voice remained steady, but Eleanor saw the grief still lingering in his eyes. Thomas was devastated. For a time, we all thought he might sell the ranch and move on. But he stayed, worked harder than ever, built his herd to one of the largest in the territory. Mrs. Whitaker reached over and patted Eleanor's hand gently. "It's not uncommon for men out here to seek wives through advertisements, dear. Many good marriages have come from such arrangements." Eleanor nodded, still confused. "I understand that loss can be devastating, Sheriff, but I don't see why this prevents me from meeting Thomas today as planned." Matthew Holloway's jaw tightened. "Because, Miss Thornton, what Thomas Keegan failed to mention in his letters was that before her death, my sister extracted a promise from him. If anything should happen to her, he would wait at least 5 years before marrying another. A promise he made on his honor as a man." Eleanor felt as though the floor had dropped beneath her. "And it's been only 3 years," she whispered, the realization dawning on her. The sheriff nodded grimly. "Thomas Keegan is a good man in many ways, Miss Thornton, but in this matter, he has broken faith. Not just with my sister's memory, but with the oath he swore to me as her only living family." His voice grew harder. "I came to town today to remind him of that oath." The sound of boots on the porch interrupted them. The door swung open, and a man entered. Medium build, sandy mustache, kind eyes creased with worry. Thomas Keegan had arrived. His gaze moved quickly past the sheriff to settle on Eleanor, and for a moment, his face brightened with unmistakable joy. "Eleanor? Eleanor Thornton?" Then his eyes shifted to the sheriff, and the joy was replaced with something closer to defiance. "You had no right, Holloway," Thomas said, his voice low but intense. "No right to interfere." The sheriff rose to his feet, his height advantage obvious as he faced the rancher. "I have every right when it comes to a promise made over my sister's grave, a promise you've chosen to forget." Eleanor stood as well, finding her voice despite the turmoil inside her. "Mr. Keegan, Thomas, is what the sheriff says true? Did you make such a promise?" Thomas's shoulders slumped slightly, but his eyes when they met hers were earnest. "I did, Eleanor, but that was a different time, a different man. The letters we've shared, the connection we've built, that's real. I've mourned Catherine properly. It's time to move forward." "Forward?" The sheriff's voice was dangerous now. "By deceiving this woman? By breaking your word?" Thomas stepped closer to Eleanor, ignoring Matthew. "I meant every word I wrote to you. I've prepared the ranch house, hired help to make it comfortable. Everything is ready for our life together." His hand reached for hers, but Eleanor found herself stepping back. "You should have told me," she said quietly, "about Catherine, about your promise. I would have understood. We could have waited." The disappointment was a physical ache in her chest. This man she had trusted enough to travel across the country for had withheld such significant truths. Thomas's face hardened. "Holloway has poisoned you against me already, just as he's tried to turn half the county against me since Catherine died." He turned to face the sheriff. "Your sister wouldn't want this, Matt. She wouldn't want you holding on to grief like it's the only thing keeping her memory alive." The sheriff's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Don't you dare tell me what Catherine would want." Mrs. Whitaker stepped between the two men, her small frame somehow commanding enough to halt their advancing confrontation. "Gentlemen, this is not the place, and certainly not the way to welcome Miss Thornton to our town." She turned to Eleanor with genuine concern. "You must be exhausted from your journey, dear. Perhaps some rest would be advisable before any decisions are made." Eleanor nodded gratefully, feeling overwhelmed by the unexpected drama surrounding her arrival. "Yes, I think that would be best." She looked between the two men, these strangers who both claimed to have her best interests at heart for entirely different reasons. "I would appreciate time to think." Thomas looked as though he wanted to object, but after a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Of course, I'll call on you tomorrow, Eleanor. We can talk privately then." He shot a final glare at the sheriff before placing his hat back on his head and departing without another word. Matthew Holloway remained, his expression troubled. "Miss Thornton, I apologize for this difficult welcome to Timber Creek. It wasn't my intention to upset you." His voice had softened considerably now that Thomas was gone. "I only wanted you to know the truth before you committed yourself." Eleanor studied him, trying to understand the man behind the badge. "Was that all, Sheriff? Or is there something more you're not telling me?" A muscle in his jaw twitched, and for a moment, something unreadable flickered in his eyes. "Get some rest, Miss Thornton. Timber Creek looks different after a good night's sleep." With that, he placed his hat back on his head, nodded respectfully to Mrs. Whitaker, and left the boarding house. Alone in her room that evening, Eleanor unpacked her belongings and tried to make sense of the day's events. She reread Thomas's letters, searching for hints of deception, but finding only the same warmth and honesty that had attracted her in the first place. Yet he had omitted such an important part of his past. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder about Sheriff Holloway and his forceful intervention. His concern seemed to extend beyond mere respect for his sister's memory. There was something personal in his objection to her marriage to Thomas, something he wasn't admitting, even to himself. Sleep came fitfully to Eleanor that night, her dreams filled with trains that never reached their destinations and faceless men making promises they couldn't keep. When morning light filtered through the lace curtains of her room, she rose and dressed with determination. She hadn't come all this way to be caught between two men's unresolved grievances. Today, she would see Timber Creek for herself and make her own judgments. The main street of Timber Creek was already bustling when Eleanor stepped out of the boarding house. Morning light bathed the dusty road in gold, softening the rough edges of the frontier town. She noticed details she'd missed during yesterday's emotional arrival. The newly painted schoolhouse at the far end of town, women shopping with baskets over their arms, children racing between buildings with hoops and sticks. It was a community, not just an outpost, with all the complexities and connections that implied. Eleanor decided to visit the general store first, hoping to learn more about both Thomas and Sheriff Holloway from sources less personally invested than the men themselves. The bell above the door jangled as she entered the mercantile, where shelves were stocked with everything, from farm equipment to fabric. Behind the counter stood a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, carefully inventorying a shipment of canned goods. "Good morning," Eleanor offered with a polite smile. "I'm new to town, Eleanor Thornton." The shopkeeper looked up, recognition dawning on his face. "Ah, Miss Thornton. News travels fast in Timber Creek. I'm Harold Jenkins." He extended a hand across the counter. "Welcome to our little corner of the territory." "I understand you've had quite the interesting arrival," Eleanor sighed. "Then you know about the situation with Mr. Keegan and Sheriff Holloway?" Harold nodded, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, though the store was empty at this early hour. "Those two have a complicated history, been walking on eggshells around each other since poor Catherine passed. God rest her soul." He began arranging tins of coffee on a shelf. "Sheriff's never forgiven Thomas, though many think he's more upset about losing the connection to Catherine than about any promise that might have been made." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. "Well," Harold leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Matthew Holloway arrived in Timber Creek about a year before his sister. Made himself indispensable as deputy, then sheriff. When Catherine came to marry Thomas, Matthew seemed genuinely pleased. They were going to be family, after all. But some folks noticed how the sheriff looked at Catherine. Not exactly brotherly, if you take my meaning." Eleanor's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything definite, Miss Thornton," Harold interrupted quickly. "Just sharing observations. The Holloways came from different mothers, grew up mostly apart. Maybe the sheriff's feelings were confused by that distance. Or maybe it was just a protective brother's concern. Either way, when Catherine died, something in Sheriff Holloway broke, and his relationship with Thomas was never the same." The bell above the door jangled again, and Harold straightened, his gossiping demeanor instantly replaced by professional courtesy as another customer entered. Eleanor thanked him and continued her exploration of Timber Creek, her mind turning over this new information. If the shopkeeper's implications were true, the sheriff's objections to her marriage might stem from something far more complicated than a broken promise. Around midday, Eleanor found herself outside the sheriff's office, drawn there by a curiosity she couldn't quite name. The building was modest, a small wooden structure with a bench outside where an older man sat whittling a piece of wood. A deputy, she presumed, by the badge pinned to his vest. He tipped his hat politely as she approached. "Is Sheriff Holloway available?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "He's inside, ma'am, catching up on wanted posters." The deputy jerked his thumb toward the door. "Go on in if you've got business." Eleanor hesitated only briefly before entering. The office was sparse but organized, with a desk covered in papers, a gun rack on the wall, and a small pot-bellied stove in the corner. Matthew Holloway looked up from his paperwork, genuine surprise registering on his face when he saw her. "Miss Thornton, I wasn't expecting to see you today." He stood quickly, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit. Can I offer you some coffee? It's been on the stove a while, but it's still warm." Eleanor declined the coffee, but took the offered seat. "I've been exploring Timber Creek, Sheriff. It seems like a decent town, thanks in part to your efforts, I assume." He acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod. "We have our share of troubles, like anywhere, but the people here are mostly good. They look out for each other." He set down his pencil and regarded her directly. "But I don't think you came by to discuss law enforcement in Timber Creek." "No," Eleanor admitted. "I came because I want to understand. Yesterday at Mrs. Whitaker's, you spoke of honor and promises, but there was something more in your objection to my marriage to Thomas. Something personal." The sheriff's expression remained neutral, But his eyes, a deep blue that reminded Eleanor of lake water, betrayed a flash of discomfort. Catherine was my sister. Her happiness was important to me. And after she died, was Thomas's happiness still important to you then? Or was it easier to keep him bound to a promise that ensured he remained alone, just as you are? Matthew leaned back in his chair, studying her with newfound respect. You don't mince words, Miss Thornton. That's a quality that will serve you well out here. He was silent for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Thomas Keegan and I were friends once. Good friends. Before Catherine. We rode together, fought outlaws together, even considered partnering on a ranch before I took the badge. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. Outside, the sounds of Timber Creek continued. A wagon rumbling past, a dog barking, the distant piano from the saloon starting up early. When Catherine came west, everything changed. Matthew continued, his voice lower now. She was beautiful, educated, refined. Everything rare and precious in this territory. Thomas fell for her immediately, and who could blame him? A shadow crossed his face. I wanted her to be happy, and Thomas was a good man. But part of you wanted her for yourself? Eleanor finished softly. It wasn't a question. The sheriff's head snapped up, his gaze hard. She was my half-sister, Miss Thornton. We shared a father, nothing more. We didn't grow up together, didn't meet until we were both adults. But yes, there were feelings that complicated things. Feelings I never acted on, never spoke of. His hands clenched on the desktop. I buried those feelings along with Catherine. What remains is my duty to honor her memory and the promise Thomas made to her. Eleanor felt a strange mixture of compassion and wariness. And what of your duty to let the living live, Sheriff? Thomas has mourned. He's ready to move forward. Why can't you grant him that peace? Because he didn't wait, Matthew said sharply. 5 years. That's all Catherine asked of him. 5 years to honor what they had together. He couldn't even give her that. His voice was bitter now. Instead, he writes to a woman halfway across the country, fills her head with promises, brings her here under false pretenses. I am not a victim, Sheriff, Eleanor interrupted, her own temper rising. I made my choice to come west based on a year of correspondence with a man who showed me nothing but respect and genuine affection. Thomas may have omitted parts of his past, but the man I've come to know through his letters is honorable and kind. Matthew stood abruptly, pacing to the window before turning back to face her. And if I told you that your heart was promised to me first, that in those letters, Thomas Keegan was writing the same words, making the same promises that he once made to Catherine? His voice was rough with emotion. The same Catherine whose memory he claims to honor while pursuing you? Eleanor rose as well, maintaining the distance between them. Is that what this is really about, Sheriff? You believe Thomas is replacing Catherine with me? That I'm somehow a core substitute for the woman you both loved? The words hung in the air between them, sharp as knives. Matthew's expression changed, the harshness giving way to something more vulnerable. No, he said finally. No, Miss Thornhorn. You are clearly your own woman, with your own strength. That much I recognized immediately. Before Eleanor could respond, the door to the sheriff's office swung open. Thomas Keegan stood in the doorway, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him. I've been looking all over town for you, Eleanor. I should have known Holloway would try to steal a march on me. His voice was tight with controlled anger. Eleanor turned to face him, suddenly aware of how the situation must appear. "No one is stealing anything, Thomas. I came here of my own accord, to better understand the situation." "And has the sheriff been filling your head with his version of events? With his interpretations of promises made in grief?" Thomas stepped fully into the office, ignoring Matthew's warning look. "Did he tell you how he shadowed Catherine from the moment she arrived? How he could barely stand to see us together? How even now he wears his badge like armor against moving forward with his own life?" Matthew moved around the desk, his hand instinctively resting on the gun at his hip. "That's enough, Thomas. Miss Thornton came here for answers, not to witness your jealousy." "Jealousy?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "That's rich coming from you, Matt. We both know who the jealous one was, and still is." Eleanor stepped between the two men, her patience exhausted. "Stop it, both of you. I didn't travel 2,000 miles to be caught in the middle of your unresolved grievances." She faced Thomas directly. "You should have told me about Catherine and about your promise. It was wrong to withhold that from me, whatever your reasons." Thomas's anger deflated somewhat under her direct gaze. "You're right," he admitted. "I should have told you, but I feared losing the chance at happiness that your letters represented." He glanced briefly at Matthew before continuing. "The 5-year promise was made in a moment of extreme grief. Catherine was dying, and I would have promised anything to ease her passing. But she wouldn't have wanted me, or her brother, to cling to grief indefinitely." "You don't know what she would have wanted," Matthew said, but the fight had gone out of his voice, replaced by a weariness that spoke of years of carrying this burden. Eleanor looked between the two men, seeing them clearly now, not as hero and villain in her story, but as complex human beings shaped by love, loss, and the harsh realities of frontier life. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to think about all of this without either of you influencing my decision." She straightened her shoulders, finding strength in her own resolve. "1 week. I'll remain at Mrs. Whitaker's for 1 week. During that time, I'll get to know Timber Creek and its people. And at the end of that week, I'll decide whether to marry Thomas as planned or to return east." Both men began to protest, but Eleanor held up her hand. "That's my decision, and I won't be swayed from it. I suggest you both use this time to reflect on what you truly want and what Catherine would have wanted for both of you." Without waiting for their response, she walked past Thomas and out of the sheriff's office, her head held high, despite the turmoil in her heart. The next week proved to be enlightening for Eleanor in ways she hadn't anticipated. True to her word, she explored Timber Creek thoroughly, introducing herself to the townspeople and observing the rhythms of frontier life. She spent time at the schoolhouse, offering to help the overwhelmed teacher with her 30 students of varying ages. She visited the small church where she was to have been married, speaking at length with the minister about faith and new beginnings. She even rode out to the edge of Thomas's ranch, though she kept her promise not to speak with him directly, only observing from a distance the land and cattle that had been described so vividly in his letters. Throughout this time, both men respected her wishes for space, though she occasionally caught glimpses of Thomas in town or saw the sheriff riding past on his daily rounds. The people of Timber Creek, however, were less restrained in sharing their opinions about both men and the situation Eleanor found herself in. Mrs. Whitaker proved to be a wealth of balanced information. "Thomas Keegan is a good man at heart," she told Eleanor one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. "He works hard, deals fairly with his hands, and has built something substantial here. But grief changes a person. When Catherine died, something in him hardened. He drove himself and his men relentlessly, as if building the ranch could fill the hole she left. "And Sheriff Holloway?" Eleanor asked, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains purple and gold. Mrs. Whitaker's expression grew thoughtful. "Matthew carries his burdens differently, more internally. He pours himself into keeping the peace, into being the man people can depend on when trouble comes." She rocked gently in her chair. "But there's a loneliness in him that hasn't eased with time. Some of us hoped he might find someone, start a family, but he keeps everyone at arm's length, except for his deputy and a few old friends." On her 5th day in Timber Creek, Eleanor's explorations took her to the town cemetery, a small, well-maintained plot of land just beyond the church. She walked among the wooden markers and stone monuments, reading the names and dates of those who had helped build this community. Near the back, beneath a cottonwood tree, she found a simple granite headstone. Catherine Holloway, beloved sister and fiancé, 1857 to 1882. Fresh wildflowers had been placed before it, recently by the look of them. "I leave them every Sunday," a voice said from behind her. Eleanor turned to find Matthew Holloway standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand. "And Thomas brings roses on the 1st of each month." Eleanor nodded, turning back to the grave. She must have been remarkable to inspire such lasting devotion from both of you. Matthew moved to stand beside her, his eyes fixed on his sister's name carved in stone. She was intelligent, kind, stubborn when it mattered. She would have thrived out here, built something meaningful with Thomas. His voice held no bitterness now, only a gentle sorrow. She would have changed this town for the better. Eleanor felt a strange connection to this woman she would never meet. This predecessor, whose place in Thomas's life had left such a profound mark. "I think she still has," Eleanor said softly. "Through both of you, in different ways." They stood in silence for a moment before Matthew spoke again. "I owe you an apology, Miss Thornton. My behavior since your arrival has been influenced by ghosts that should have been laid to rest long ago. It wasn't fair to you." Eleanor studied his profile, strong, weathered, marked by experiences both harsh and meaningful. "And Thomas, do you owe him an apology as well?" Matthew's jaw tightened slightly. "Perhaps we were friends once. Good friends." He paused, struggling with something internally. "The truth is, I've held on to that promise not just for Catherine's sake, but for my own. As long as Thomas remained bound by it, I didn't have to face moving forward either." The honesty of his admission touched Eleanor deeply. And now? He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes clear in the afternoon light. "Now I think it's time we all stop living in the shadow of what might have been." He placed his hat back on his head. "Whatever you decide at the end of your week, Miss Thornton, know that you have my respect. Timber Creek could use more women with your strength of character." As he turned to leave, Eleanor called after him, "Sheriff, if things had been different, if you and I had met under other circumstances, what would you have seen in me? Not as Catherine's replacement, but as myself." Matthew stopped, considering her question carefully. When he looked back, there was something new in his expression, an openness that transformed his features. "I would have seen a woman of remarkable courage, someone who knows her own mind, someone who might make a man reconsider the walls he's built around himself." He tipped his hat slightly. "Good day, Miss Thornton." The final 2 days of Eleanor's self-imposed deadline passed quickly. On the morning of the 7th day, she woke with a clarity that surprised her. After breakfast, she asked Mrs. Whitaker to deliver 2 messages, one to Thomas Keegan's ranch and one to the sheriff's office. Both contained the same request: to meet her at the church at noon. The small white church stood empty when Eleanor arrived, sunlight streaming through its simple stained glass windows. She sat in a pew near the front, hands folded in her lap, and waited. Thomas arrived first, his hair neatly combed, wearing a clean shirt and his best vest. He nodded respectfully, but said nothing as he took a seat across the aisle. Minutes later, Sheriff Holloway entered, pausing briefly when he saw Thomas already present. After a moment's hesitation, he removed his hat and sat several pews behind them both. Eleanor rose and turned to face them. "Thank you both for coming. I've made my decision, but before I share it, there's something I need to say to both of you." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "When I came to Timber Creek, I thought I knew what my future held. I believed I was arriving to marry a man I had come to know through his words alone. Instead, I found myself caught in the middle of a story that began long before me, a story of love, loss, and promises made in grief." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Matthew remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "During this week, I've learned much about both of you, not just from your own words, but from the people whose lives you've touched. Thomas, you've built something remarkable here. Your ranch provides for many families, and your generosity during last year's drought is still spoken of with gratitude." She turned slightly to address the sheriff. "Matthew, your dedication to justice and to this community has made Timber Creek a place where people feel safe to build their futures. Both of you are good men who have allowed the past to cast too long a shadow over your present." Eleanor moved to stand at the altar, where she would have spoken her wedding vows. "I came west, seeking a new beginning, a chance to build a life filled with purpose and, yes, love. I still want those things." She paused, her gaze moving between the two men. "But I cannot in good conscience marry a man who is still bound, whether by promise or by unresolved grief, to another." Thomas stood abruptly. "Eleanor, please, the connection we built through our letters was real. I meant every word I wrote to you." "I believe you did," she said gently. "But we both know there are wounds here that need healing before any new promises can be made." She turned her attention to Matthew. "And you, Sheriff, have used your sister's memory as a shield against your own future. It's time for both of you to truly honor Catherine by moving forward with your lives, not by remaining trapped in the moment of her loss." The church fell silent, save for the soft creaking of the wooden pews. Outside, life in Timber Creek continued. Horses' hooves on packed dirt, children's distant laughter, the blacksmith's hammer striking iron. It was a town built on second chances, Eleanor had discovered. A place where people came to reinvent themselves, to build something meaningful from the raw materials of their past experiences. "My decision," Eleanor continued with newfound confidence, "is to remain in Timber Creek, but not as Thomas's wife. At least, not yet. Mrs. Peterson has offered me a position as her assistant at the school. It's work I know well and find fulfilling." She smiled slightly. "In time when grief has been properly honored and new beginnings properly prepared for, perhaps Thomas and I might reconsider our arrangement, or perhaps my path will lead elsewhere. But that decision will be made without ghosts standing between us." She looked directly at Matthew now. "And you, Sheriff, have a friendship to rebuild and your own future to consider. Catherine would want that for both of you, I think." The two men exchanged glances, years of tension and unspoken words hanging between them. After a long moment, Matthew stood and took several steps forward, stopping just short of where Thomas stood. He extended his hand. "She's right, Tom. Catherine would have been the first to tell us to stop this feud. It doesn't honor her memory. It tarnishes it." Thomas hesitated only briefly before grasping the sheriff's hand. "She always did have more sense than either of us." His voice was rough with emotion. "I've missed your friendship, Matt. The ranch hasn't been the same without your terrible poker playing on Saturday nights." A ghost of a smile touched Matthew's lips. "And the town's been quieter without your catastrophic attempts at singing after your third whiskey." Eleanor watched as something long broken began the slow process of mending. It wasn't a perfect resolution. There were too many complicated feelings and history for that, but it was an honest beginning. As the men released their handshake, Thomas turned to Eleanor. "I understand your decision," he said, his expression a mixture of disappointment and respect. "And I'll respect the time and space you're asking for. But I want you to know that my feelings haven't changed. If you're ready to reconsider, my offer stands." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging his words without making promises she wasn't prepared to keep. As both men prepared to leave the church, Matthew paused beside her. "Timber Creek just got more interesting, Miss Thornton," he said quietly, a new warmth in his blue eyes. "I look forward to seeing how you change it for the better." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor settled into her new role at the schoolhouse, discovering a community eager to embrace her skills and perspective. Thomas called on her occasionally, their conversations gradually evolving from awkward attempts to recapture their letter-writing rapport to something more genuine and present. Matthew, too, found reasons to cross her path, assisting with a troublesome student, escorting her home after dark when she worked late, even attending the school's harvest pageant, despite his well-known discomfort with public gatherings. Timber Creek observed this developing situation with the keen interest of a frontier town starved for entertainment. Opinions were divided on which man would ultimately win Eleanor's affections, with Harold at the general store maintaining a discreet betting pool that grew with each passing week. For her part, Eleanor found herself drawn to both men for different reasons. Thomas's steady determination and vision for the future, Matthew's principled strength and unexpected gentle humor. But what surprised her most was her growing attachment to Timber Creek itself. This dusty outpost at the edge of civilization had begun to feel like home in ways Boston never had. Here, she was valued for her contributions, respected for her intelligence, and accepted despite the unconventional circumstances of her arrival. The promise she had sought in coming west remained alive, though transformed into something she couldn't have anticipated when she first stepped off the train. On a crisp autumn evening, Eleanor stood on Mrs. Whitaker's porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to build the life she wanted. But tonight, in this moment of perfect stillness, between what had been and what might be, Eleanor Horton was exactly where she belonged. In a place where second chances were not just possible, but expected, and where the heart's promises, once broken, could be remade stronger than before.